Bienvenidos a este primer Congreso Virtual de Estudios Norteamericanos Somos Región, organizado por la Red de Investigadores Norteamericanistas y por el Centro de Investigaciones sobre América del Norte de la Coordinación de Humanidades de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. Es para mí un gran honor estar aquí compartiendo esta pantalla con la coordinadora de humanidades, la directora del CISAN y el distinguido doctor Michael Brescia, quien nos dará la ponencia principal inaugural. Antes que nada, y después de agradecer su presencia y conectarse a nuestras redes del YouTube del CISAN y en el Facebook del CISAN, y gracias por seguirnos, cedo la palabra a la coordinadora de humanidades, la doctora Guadalupe Valencia García.
Muchísimas gracias, muy buenos días. Es un gusto saludarles, doctora Graciela Martínez-Zalce, directora del CISAN. Gracias por esta invitación. Juan Carlos Barrón, doctor Juan Carlos, muchas gracias también. Doctor Michael Brescia, qué gusto conocerlo y le agradecemos que nos ofrezca esta conferencia magistral. Y bueno, creo que es un evento muy importante. Será tal vez, ojalá así sea, uno de los últimos que en este año haremos de forma virtual. A lo mejor cambiaremos a formas híbridas y después a formas presenciales, pero nos encaminamos hacia allá. Pero han mostrado todas sus virtudes estos eventos a distancia en teleconferencia, donde la distancia es solo simulada, solo virtual, porque en realidad logramos mucha participación de grupos muy amplios que tal vez no lograríamos de manera presencial. Y bueno, el título de este Congreso Virtual de Estudios Norteamericanos, Somos Región, a manera de pregunta, me pareció muy provocador, porque estas preguntas que no admiten por respuesta un sí o un no, pues son preguntas que nos permiten explorar todas las aristas y dimensiones de las respuestas posibles y de sus posibles gradaciones de forma muy rica, y que nos permiten incorporar otras preguntas más. Sí, si lo somos, cómo lo somos, por qué, cómo, cuándo, dónde. Y por eso es importantísimo iniciar con una conferencia magistral que nos hable de América del Norte desde una aproximación histórica, y que nos va acercando no a la respuesta a la pregunta, porque estoy clara que esa pregunta no tiene una sola respuesta, sino a las posibilidades de contar con elementos para construir respuestas e interpretaciones muy ricas, como corresponde a una comunidad académica en donde la inteligencia colectiva realmente ha logrado construcciones, interpretaciones muy importantes para entender la región. Sin más, porque yo no soy desde luego ponente, pero me provocó mucho su pregunta y su título, pues les saludo nuevamente agradeciendo la oportunidad que me dan de participar en la inauguración. Muchísimas gracias y les deseo mucho éxito en este primer congreso virtual.
Muchísimas gracias, doctora Valencia. Es un honor ser parte de esta coordinación y de este trabajo que se está realizando en pro de la múltiples investigaciones, y en nuestro caso la investigación inter y transdisciplinaria que llevamos a cabo sobre esta parte del mundo, y que pues nos lleva a preguntas sin fin y a múltiples áreas de investigación que se estarán mostrando a lo largo de este congreso. Muchísimas gracias. Y pues gracias a la doctora Graciela Martínez-Zalce, directora del Centro de Investigación sobre América del Norte. Si gusta decirnos unas palabras.
Gracias, doctor Barrón, doctora Valencia, doctor Brescia, muchas gracias por estar con nosotros en esta inauguración. Durante 31 años el CISAN se ha dedicado a estudiar la economía, la política, las sociedades y las culturas de Estados Unidos y Canadá y las relaciones que guardan con México. Desde la firma del Telecán en 1994, estos tres países se han erigido como una de las conformaciones económicas regionales más dinámicas en el mundo, a pesar de las asimetrías que en ella conviven y de que en ocasiones sus perspectivas políticas no coinciden. Las firmas de los tratados comerciales también han contribuido a que nuestros vecinos norteños miren al sur de tal modo que en este más de un cuarto de siglo nuestras sociedades están más alertas unas de otras y existen mayores intercambios culturales. Entonces nosotros, al preguntarnos si somos región, queríamos un poco jugar con la idea de si la firma del Tratado de Libre Comercio nos había impuesto a nosotras las y los mexicanos una obligación de mirar hacia el norte y a los estadounidenses y canadienses una, pues por lo menos una alerta para que miraran un poquito al sur, pero también estamos conscientes de que las regiones no solo se forman por las firmas de tratados o por lo que los gobiernos quieran, sino por las interacciones sociales, culturales, políticas de las personas que viven en esas regiones. La red norteamericanista surge de la inquietud por descubrir las voces de quienes compartimos este objeto de estudio y de la necesidad de que nos encontremos para difundir, discutir y reflexionar acerca de nuestros resultados de investigación y de socializar y compartir en un entorno académico nuestras experiencias en tanto estudiosos y estudiosas de la región, y al hacerlo integrar a las diversas generaciones que se reúnen en esta centena de miembros de la red de estudios norteamericanos. Pues lamentamos mucho que el Congreso no se haya podido llevar en aquel espectacular sitio que habíamos previsto, que era el Palacio de Medicina en el Centro Histórico, y agradecemos mucho a quienes, a pesar de por las circunstancias que el virus nos impuso, aún así quisieron un año después presentar sus trabajos muy probablemente modificados por la reflexión en que hemos estado viviendo los últimos 15 meses. Yo quiero agradecer a la Coordinación de Humanidades, a la coordinadora que siempre ha apoyado nuestros proyectos intelectuales y nuestras actividades, a la Secretaría Académica del CISAN, a la Secretaría Técnica con sus componentes de cómputo, de educación continua, a nuestros compañeros de apoyo a la investigación que quisieron participar apoyando en la dificultad de las sesiones, porque aparentemente es muy fácil prender el Zoom, pero a diferencia de cuando estamos en salones, tener varios salones virtuales es mucho más complejo que estar en vivo y a todo color, y también a difusión por precisamente la difusión que se hizo de este evento. Espero que tengamos 5 días que, aunque son intensos, sean disfrutables para todos y todas. Muchas gracias. Doctor Barrón, por favor.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, doctora Martínez-Zalce, por sus palabras. Y pues bueno, me acabo de percatar que falta declarar inaugurado formalmente el Congreso antes de presentar a nuestro conferencista inaugural. Doctora Valencia, no sé si nos haría usted el honor de decir, formalizar el inicio de nuestro Congreso, por favor.
Con todo gusto. El honor es para mí, doctor Barrón. Y bueno, siendo las 9 de la mañana con 12 minutos en la Ciudad de México, es un gusto y un honor declarar inaugurado el primer Congreso Virtual de Estudios Norteamericanos Somos Región. Muchísimas gracias y les deseo el mayor de los éxitos.
muchísimas gracias. Muchísimas gracias, doctora Valencia. Y pues que así sea, que sea un éxito. Y bueno, para un éxito, pues qué mejor que comenzar de la mejor manera. Y bueno, es para mí un honor y un gusto presentar a mi querido amigo y colega y además, pues bueno, ahora pues un importante eslabón en el trabajo del consorcio entre la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México y la Universidad de Arizona, el doctor Michael Brescia, quien además pues es de ser una gran personalidad en el mundo de la curaduría a cargo de etnohistoria en el Museo del Estado de Arizona y ser profesor del Departamento de Historia y del Colegio de Leyes James Rogers de la Universidad de Arizona. Ha dado múltiples clases, pero también es autor. Principalmente, pues esto es algo muy relevante. Él es autor de la obra, coautor con John Soper, es coautor de la obra North America, An Introduction, una obra pues indispensable para comprender desde una óptica diferente, desde una óptica regional y no desde la perspectiva de las naciones como tradicionalmente se hace, una mirada histórica al nacimiento e importancia de nuestra región. Él pues da clases en esta Universidad de Arizona, da muchísimas clases, historia de México, historia comparada de América del Norte, la ley y los recursos naturales en las fronteras españolas, historia mundial, métodos de investigación en historia, en fin. Y bueno, además pues es un gran y prolífico escritor que ha sido publicado no solamente este libro que les mencionaba yo, sino también el libro Mexico and the United States, Ambivalent Vistas. También ha escrito múltiples artículos en revistas especializadas como Western Legal History, The Public Historian, Journal of the Southwest, California Legal History y otros. Y pues bueno, es el líder curador de las exhibiciones de Many Mexicos, Vistas de la Frontera, Intimacy of Faith, Retablos and Exvotos from Mexico, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Entonces es una persona que tiene esta amplitud y que nos hace el honor de mostrarnos pues una gran confluencia de perspectivas, la historia, la ley, las artes, la preservación en los museos. Y pues bueno, es para mí un verdadero honor que él sea nuestro ponente inaugural. Muchas gracias, doctor Michael Brescia, por haber aceptado esta invitación. Adelante.
Pues muchas gracias, muy amable. Muy buenos días a todos. Good morning, everyone. Although I will give my keynote address in English, I want to direct my opening remarks in Spanish. So, aunque voy a impartir la conferencia en inglés, mi lengua materna, quiero compartir con ustedes unas palabritas en español. Es un gran honor para mí impartir esta conferencia magistral al primer Congreso virtual de Estudios Norteamericanos. Como historiador con muchos años investigando los vínculos históricos entre los 3 países principales del continente norteamericano, me es grato dirigirme a los investigadores de varios campos de estudio: la ciencia política, la historia, la sociología, el derecho, la antropología, la literatura, la economía, entre otros. Aunque contamos con varios marcos conceptuales para dar sentido a la integración económica, política y social del continente, no es sorprendente que, debido a las diferencias entre el desarrollo histórico de Canadá, México, Estados Unidos, falte una estructura acordada para historizar cómo llegamos a 2021 de la manera como lo hicimos. esta mañana trataré de construir una aproximación histórica que es a la vez sensible a la singularidad de cada país y abierta a los corrientes globales muy profundos que han unido el continente por los siglos de los siglos. Espero que la conferencia magistral pueda funcionar como un punto de referencia histórica para los integrantes del Congreso, tomando en cuenta que nada tiene sentido cuando se ve de forma aislada. Por último, quisiera reconocer y agradecer a la doctora Guadalupe Valencia García, coordinadora de Humanidades UNAM, a la doctora Graciela Martínez-Zalce, directora del CISAN UNAM, y al doctor Juan Carlos Barrón Pastor, por su amable invitación de dar la conferencia magistral. Con respecto a Juancho, y les digo con mucho afecto, Juancho, a quien tuve el placer de conocer hace 2 años acá en Tucson, en la Universidad de Arizona, durante un simposio binacional entre el Colegio de San Luis y la Universidad de Arizona y UNAM. Y además de reunirme con Juancho, también conocí el doctor Roberto Cepeda Martínez. Y entre los dos he aprendido mucho sobre nuestro continente. Y por el hecho que están presentes la doctora Guadalupe y la doctora Graciela, quiero decirles con mucho gusto y con toda la verdad que ustedes tienen mucha suerte de tener Juancho y Roberto Cepeda, miembros de la facultad. Muchas felicidades a CISAN UNAM. Y también otra vez el gran gusto, el gran honor para mí ser la conferencista inaugural. Pues ya voy a poner a un lado mi acento estadounidense y voy a hablar en mi lengua materna. Between January 1st, 1994 and 2021, under the executive leadership of Justin Trudeau, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and Donald Trump, North America has experienced the growing pains of unity, convergence, and symmetry. As we all know, the day NAFTA took effect on New Year's Day, 1994, the Zapatistas launched an attack against the government of Carlos Salinas de Gortari, citing the free trade agreement and the erosion of the moral economy that had characterized post-revolutionary relations between Mexico's political establishment under the ruling PRI and Mexico's indigenous population. A year later, A year later, in 1995, citizens in Quebec went to the polls to vote on a measure that would have given the Premier of Quebec the authority to push for sovereignty and separation from the rest of Canada. The pro-sovereignty faction lost by the narrowest of margins. 24 years later, in 2019, the political party Bloc Québécois revitalized under their new leader, Yves François Blanchet, jumped to 32 seats in the predominantly French-speaking province. Quebec accounts for 78 seats in Canada's lower house, the House of Commons, second only to Ontario. As Blanchet, and you see him there on the screen, as he said during his press conference, we have come far, but we will go further. The Bloc Québécois resurgence meant that Justin Trudeau reduced his seats in the parliament to a minority. Surveys show, though, las encuestas, the surveys show support for Quebec independence is far below the levels it hit in 1995, when a referendum on breaking away only just failed.
Sorry, Michael, for interruption. I think that you have a presentation and we are not seeing it. So I don't know if.
Let me see.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. ¿Y ahora?
Ya se
Ahora
ve.
sí, perfectamente. Gracias.
Sí, mil disculpas.
Al contrario, gracias.
Sí. Entonces, estaba hablando de nuevo premier de Quebec, Blanchet, que su partido Bloc Québécois ganó muchos lugares en el Parlamento de Canadá. Blanchet has muted talk of separatism, positioning the Bloc as a party that wants to stand up for Quebec's interests and the French language in the federal parliament in Ottawa, rather than actively seeking to break up the country. So between the Zapatistas, and then also the separatist movement in Quebec, although it's now been muted, and of course, there's the former American president, Donald J. Trump. These late 20th century and early 21st century phenomena are only two examples of divergent forces at work in North America. Others include Canada's and Mexico's significant opposition to the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, and stark differences that reflect uneven paths of historical development are found throughout the continent. Economic data consistently show that Mexico's per capita gross national product lags far behind that of Canada and the United States. Wage data confirm the difference. According to the OECD statistics, average wages across all industries and service sectors are $17,000 in Mexico, $53,000 in Canada, and nearly $66,000 in the United States. And certainly, the early 21st century manifestation of populism under Donald Trump and Andrés Manuel López Obrador have magnified these divergences and highlight these asymmetries as Trump pushed for a renegotiation of NAFTA that led to last year's USMCA agreement. And of course, we know that Trump employed anti-immigrant rhetoric during his two presidential campaigns. Such differences dramatize the uneven, asymmetrical development of North America. Asymmetries also exist within countries and regions. Chiapas, for example, is the poorest state in Mexico, marginalized and distant from the centers of wealth and power. And the Zapatista rebellion was but a violent reaction against stark inequality. In Canada, at different times in the historical development of the provinces, Atlantic Canada, the so-called maritime provinces, and Quebec were in a dependent relationship with the more industrialized and richer province of Ontario. Much like in the United States, Appalachia's dependent relationship with the wealthier mid-Atlantic seaboard states. These asymmetries, though, imply symmetries. Very poor rural workers, whatever their region or country of residence, share certain characteristics, just as very wealthy financiers have similarities. Asymmetry and symmetry, convergence and divergence, all have been and will continue to be part of the North American experience. The idea of unity and symmetry in North American history has deep roots. Historians have long discussed American history, entre comillas, la historia americana. Historians have long discussed American history as something distinct from European history. Beginning in the 16th century, when, from the European point of view, the history of North America, indeed, the history of the entire Western Hemisphere, was still very young. Interest was often more in the natural than the historical world. Even the great works of natural history of the period, such as Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo's Historia General y Natural de las Indias, took a general comparative approach to the Americas, which at the time were still called Las Indias, the Indies, an extension of Spain and Portugal in the so-called New World. In the 17th century, the growing presence of the French and English led to a more complex rendering of American history as a way of promoting European interests, broadly understood, or the interest of one European nation against another. In their broad musings and theorizing, authors and writers still took an interest in continental and hemispheric themes. William Robertson of Scotland wrote a widely read and influential book on the early history of the Americas entitled The History of the Discovery and Settlement of America, which was published in 1839. He expressed the exaggerations and generalizations, good and bad, of the age. A simple but elegant phrase from his work describes the grandeur of America. Quote, "Nature seems here to have carried on her operations upon a larger scale and with a bolder hand, and to have distinguished the features of this country by a peculiar magnificence," end quote. The grandeur of America, of the continent specifically, was a theme much repeated through the centuries. With the rapid rise and consolidation of the nation state in the Americas and in Europe during the 19th century, national histories swept aside earlier general histories. In fact, history as a discipline, as a profession, was built around the emerging state, even more so than, say, geography or literature. And as expected, historians came to emphasize the differences, the uniqueness, the special qualities of their respective nations' past instead of the similarities and commonalities with other nations, particularly their neighbors. Often they reached far into the past to do so, at times bending, distorting the historical record to suit their ideological beliefs. Even the best of the 19th century historians had difficulty looking beyond their borders, except when discussing diplomacy or foreign affairs. Lucas Alamán's Mexico or George Bancroft's United States extol the special features and characteristics of the new nations. In the northern reaches of the continent, the Quebec historian François Xavier Garneau, in his oft-reprinted work, Histoire du Canada, glorified the virtues of French Canadians, especially their struggles to preserve their cultural and social domain. In these works, it is possible to identify the seeds, las semillas del siglo XX, the seeds of the 20th century trends and patterns. Mexico was already plagued by ideological debates that would spiral into revolution after 1910, along with the ever-present cautious approach to their neighbor to the north. Meanwhile, in the United States, historians often expressed haughtiness, a self-righteousness, una arrogancia, that guided domestic and foreign policy in the 20th century. In Canada, Quebec nationalism continued to draw inspiration and legitimacy from the historians of earlier days, while Anglo-Canadian scholars, much like their Mexican counterparts, cast a leery eye toward their neighbor to the south and looked across the pond, the Atlantic Ocean, to Britain for cultural affinity. A few scholars, however, strove for a continental vision, albeit an imperfect one that reflected both subtle and overt biases of the time. Hubert Howe Bancroft one of the most prodigious historians of a generation known for exhaustive and verbose histories, is a good example. He published his works, all 39 volumes, between 1886 and 1890. Separately, they carried titles such as The Native Races of the North Pacific States of North America, Central America, History of Mexico, History of North Mexican States and Texas. Bancroft's work suffered at times from the moralizing and racism that was common to the late 20th century history, but it was all encompassing in conception and scope. Other examples come from journalists who try to make sense of the different paths of development in North America, in fact, throughout the Americas. One still worth reading is entitled South America, Observations and Impressions. And this was written by James Bryce and published in 1912. James Bryce and many of his contemporaries believed that South America began at the Rio Bravo, the Rio Grande. Mexico was Spanish America by virtue of its indigenous populations and patterns of European conquest and colonization. Different languages, religions, and social systems divided Spanish America from what he called Teutonic America. Quote, they were, in fact, unlike in everything except their position in the Western Hemisphere, end quote. This attitude stymied 20th century efforts to interpret North American history as a whole rather than as discrete political polities distinct from each other. 19th and early 20th century geographers did not have the same problem of the narrow nationalist forces that trapped most historians. They were impressed by the geographic and geological unity of North America. Plains and plateaus and cordilleras, or mountain ranges, ran north and south with little regard for political boundaries, giving the continent a coherence that defied man-made borders. Many thought that both the northern and southern borders lacked meaningful geographic barriers. The 49th parallel separating Canada and the United States was perhaps the most artificial of all, but there was little geographic difference to explain the division between Mexico and the United States from Tijuana to El Paso. At that point, the Rio Bravo, the Rio Grande, albeit in a very modest way, begins to divide the two countries. States, provinces, and countries were thin plastic veneers covering a structure of solid oak trees. Geographers recognize this more readily than historians, leading to observations about the potential unity of North America. A widely read French observer of North America, André Siegfried, put it this way, quote, the Americas seem to have a north-south axis and also an east-west one. The former is geographic and is the principal one because it results from the very conformation of the continents themselves. It is expressed by the majestic geological folds, by the vertical arrangement of the climatic zones, and the natural trend of commerce. It is even to be seen in the flow of public opinion. One feels that its effects are inevitable, and that in the end, it will overcome all resistance, end quote. The resistance to integration and unification also engendered an economic malaise that kept the poorer regions of the hemisphere from developing. Extreme examples include the many islands of the Caribbean basin, where a type of balkanization existed that prevented political, economic, and social development. Removing political boundaries would reduce the artificial obstacles to growth and progress, or so many people thought. It is possible to see these arguments as an academic diffusion of the manifest destiny, el destino manifiesto, that had not yet expired in the United States. This belief in a divinely led expansion helped push the United States to the Pacific coast of the continent. Like some juggernaut, the United States crushed all opposition in its path. By the late 19th century, the country was poised to impose its political, economic, and cultural life on new lands. The time period is important to place the interpretation in perspective. In 1898, the Spanish-American War had just been fought and won by the US, and it had acquired an empire as a result. Political and economic sentiment for expansion ran high in the United States, and the geographic interpretation of development bolstered the undercurrents of manifest destiny. It is just as important to remember the settlement patterns of the time. High and low plains, los llanos, along the international borders had fewer people residing on them. The agricultural, mining, transportation, and manufacturing industries that revolutionized the US-Mexico border had not yet begun. Most of the southern border was a frontier where few people lived. A late 19th century geographer wrote, quote, "The centers of gravity of the Mexican and Anglo-Saxon republics will always be separated by a distance of at least 15 or 1,600 miles. And the intervening space largely consists of arid regions where the populations must always be scattered. Thus, Mexico and the United States seem destined to remain distinct ethnological domains," end quote. And that comes from the 19th century geographer Elisée Reclus. Only visionaries could foretell the growth that would take place over the course of the next century. Few 20th century historians embraced convergence and symmetry as a conceptual framework for understanding North American history. The most influential was Herbert Eugene Bolton, a professor of history at the University of California, Berkeley, whose fame rests on many contributions to the discipline, but the most widely cited is the keynote address that he gave as president of the American Historical Association at its annual meeting held in Toronto, Canada in 1932, imposingly titled "The Epic of Greater America." In the introduction to his keynote address, Professor Bolton said, quote, "The increasing importance of inter-American relations makes imperative a better understanding by each of the history and culture of all. A synthetic view is important, not alone for its present-day political and commercial implications. It is quite as desirable from the standpoint of correct historiography." Bolton did not use geography to support his so-called correct historiography. Rather, he sketched the themes of commonality in the history of America. Most important were similar colonial patterns of development, such as vestiges of feudalism, mercantilism, slavery, indigenous European relations, international conflicts, and the violence of the political movements to break away from Europe. Bolton argued that the similarities continued after independence. Quote, "In the whole process of national growth and unification in the 19th century, the outstanding factors were boundless natural resources, foreign immigration, foreign capital, and expanding markets." Influenced by the work of one of his mentors, Frederick Jackson Turner, Bolton placed much importance on European civilization and the institutions that Europeans founded in North America, in fact, throughout the Western Hemisphere. From Bolton's viewpoint, Europeans entered the Americas developed within the new environment, and eventually created the various independent nation states and experiences of the 19th century. Bolton's history of the Americas started with the general European background and the cultural and institutional premises of American history, followed by the occupation of the American continents and the transmission of European civilization in particular variations: Dutch, English, French, Portuguese, Spanish. His history of the Americas ended with colonial expansions and international rivalries. After the first stage of history, the Spanish and British colonies won independence and eventually independence for the Brazilians and Canadians. Bolton then looked at national development within the context of relations with the outside world, and finally ended with a view of contemporary Americas. Bolton argued that the individual should first view the history of the Americas in this broader context. National histories could then be studied, but only within this broader context. Over time, historians began to refer to Professor Bolton, his work, as a theory, Bolton's theory, best described by one of his students, a Jesuit scholar, John Francis Bannon, who wrote, quote, Bolton's theory, the America's device, was a technique, an approach, which sought to highlight similarities and dissimilarities to heighten appreciation and understanding of the human experience in the Western Hemisphere, end quote. Bolton himself never thoroughly analyzed the concept to the satisfaction of the historical community. While he had given the concept considerable thought, he was not particularly philosophical or analytical about it. Bolton certainly told the story adequately, but he seemed unable to realize the broader implications of his theory. Moreover, he never stressed comparative history or comparative methodology, despite the fact that European historians, such as Marc Bloch or Henri Pirenne, had published works that had been disseminated among US scholars. He certainly knew about theoretical models for comparative history. Bolton simply chose not to explain in analytical fashion how his students might think comparatively. Bolton was not the first to talk about or do big history, as I mentioned. Historians and their ideas never develop in a vacuum, and this was true of Herbert Eugene Bolton. In many ways, he built on the work of others and developed a new approach to an old concept. While he was studying in college and in graduate school in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, profound changes were taking place in the North American continent. On one side, the United States was becoming a world power, seeking commercial and military advantage in Latin America, fighting against Spain in 1898, and acquiring former Spanish possessions in the Caribbean and Pacific. The first social revolution of the 20th century took place in Mexico, as urban and rural workers came together to overthrow Porfirio Diaz. For its part, Canada broke away from Great Britain to become a confederation with autonomy and self-rule in all matters except foreign policy. At this time, historians were looking at regional history in a broader perspective, and many of them were appalled by the lack of world knowledge that Americans possessed. And I might add, that's still true today, unfortunately. The opening of the Panama Canal in 1914 caused many scholars to focus on the history of the Pacific Ocean and its link with European expansion as regional history with which Americans should be familiar. In a similar vein, Bolton himself was influenced by world events. When he taught his History of the Americas course in 1928, President-elect Herbert Hoover traveled to Latin America and initiated what became his successor Franklin Delano Roosevelt's good neighbor policy. By the early 1940s, the United States State Department viewed Bolton as one of the leading specialists on inter-American relations. Government officials utilized his expertise and that of his students, many of whom joined the State Department's Latin American desk during World War II and subsequently during the Cold War. The value of Bolton's theory is that it goes beyond the limitations of national histories. It gives us a better understanding of the history and culture of the entire hemisphere, and for our purposes of North America. It inculcates more meaning into national histories by assessing them in light of the bigger picture. It presents race, class, ethnicity, and gender through a continental framework, which pushes our students to think comparatively. And it also helps us to avoid ethnocentrism, whether it's Mexico or Canada, the United States, that we are part of something bigger. But of course, there's also multiple critiques. Do the similarities take precedence over the differences? From my reading of the literature, the vast majority of historians would be quite hesitant to say yes. Also, in Bolton's theory, there is little room for indigenous peoples, por los indígenas. And then finally, his theory is very narrative-based. It is narrative rather than analytical. There are no deep interpretation or analysis. There's no theoretical model presented and debated. There was some historical fallout to what came to be known as the Bolton theory. A few adventurous historians led the charge and wrote about the Americas in sweeping terms. Some gave geography the obligatory first chapter, others ignored it altogether. When they did emphasize geography, they often did so by describing land as an obstacle to overcome in the course of national expansion, not as a basis for finding regional commonalities. In the end, the Bolton theory, the Bolton approach faltered, the victim of political boundaries that stood too tall. The history of the Americas idea, the history of North America idea, fell from grace, and there was no North American historian there to catch it. The exception, though, there was an exception, the colonial history of North America. Historians continue to use a comparative framework to explain European colonization and settlement of North America, based on the assumption that the imposition of Europe on America followed broadly parallel patterns of development. Spain, England, and France were different, but the process of discovery, contact, and colonization offered unifying themes for analysis. Exploration, Indian-European interaction, extractive economies, Atlantic commercial relations, colonial political administrations, all and more could be explained through a comparative analysis. In fact, Bolton wrote a book called Colonization of North America, and that's an early example of this kind of study. The similarities apparently came to an end in the late 18th century, either in 1763 with the end of the 7 Years' War, or in 1783 when the United States achieved its independence. This approach has its usefulness, but it overemphasizes the influence of European political institutions and minimizes the diversity that continues to characterize the continent, especially in those regions with large indigenous populations. It also minimizes the long history of the continent before the arrival of Europeans. I now want to turn our attention to the theme of convergence. In the 19th century, new and powerful forces began to exert influences that surpassed those of earlier times. The steam engine, the railroad, the telegraph and telephone, the increase of commercial agriculture, the rise of the factory, and the beginnings of the industrial city all work their influence in one way or another from the Yukon to the Yucatan. These convergent forces did not impose unity or uniformity, but they did create some similarities in the path of historical development. Other convergent forces helped to integrate North America in the 20th century. One example is national defense, traditionally a priority for all three countries. To the south, the Mexican-American Commission of Continental Defense increased protection against possible Nazi and Japanese attacks during World War II. After the war, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union focused attention on the North, where Canada and the United States cooperated in signing the North American Air Defense Agreement in 1957, one of many Canadian-US defense pacts. More evident in the early 21st century, more evident than defense issues are economic issues. Capital, technology, and economic organizations are spreading at a rapid pace. Debates over NAFTA, of course, in the 1990s, and the debates over the USMCA agreement only shows the reality of how much economic life fuses North America together. Debates over NAFTA and USMCA have heightened awareness of other convergent forces. Mexican immigration has been the most controversial, but there has also been widespread attention given to environmental problems. But international discussions began with concern over northern waterways and acid rain, particularly in the Great Lakes region. And then environmental attention shifted to the US-Mexican border, extensive pollution in the US-Mexican border. There is now agreement that environmental issues have to be studied in a continental, if not hemispheric perspective. Environmental and economic issues, along with political ones, bear directly on emerging indigenous objectives. The Zapatista uprising in Chiapas in 1994 exemplifies these interconnections. Reverberations from the uprising spread quickly to the north, especially in Canada, where the Assembly of First Nations insisted that Canada support the Zapatista demands. Education is finally responding to the reality of these interconnections. New efforts in the late 20th and early 21st centuries seek to continue to increase cooperation between institutions of higher education in Mexico, Canada, and the United States. In fact, this primer Congreso Virtual de Estudios Norteamericanos is a great example, a very rewarding example of cooperation and collaboration between Canada, US, and Mexico with our wonderful hosts, nuestros anfitriones, CISAN, UNAM. A profusion of new programs and agreements are integrating North America in stronger and more pervasive ways than in the past, creating a new form of continentalism that draws its sustenance from the continuous movement of people, products, and ideas back and forth borders. This is occurring as part of a wider global movement. Manufacturers, marketers, and pundits, always in search of the telling phrase, now speak of the borderless consumer, the individual whose behavior is not bound by culture or nation, but by global economic and social trends, which are sweeping through North America and the rest of the world. But of course, we know the forces of convergence just make up one dimension. We also need to talk about divergence. The movement toward North American integration has its limits, as we all know. Most North Americans do not yet have a sense of a continental identity. They do not have a sense of a shared reality that is affecting their future. divergent rather than convergent forces preoccupy many, draining attention and energy from shared issues, problems, and themes. In the political realm in particular, divergence seems to reign. Despite new continental organizations epitomized by NAFTA and then by the USMCA agreement, basic political contours continue to be strained by local and regional drives for autonomy. It is not really nationalism, but regionalism that appears to be the greatest challenge to a broader North American political organization. But I'll also throw in populism that I'll mention in a little bit. Chiapas and Quebec have already been mentioned as divergent forces. Groups within Chiapas were demanding recognition and support for basic human needs and rights. Quebec was different, is different. Far from being a region exploited and abused by Canada, it is a wealthy democratic society that has success in resolving most of its problems, except for the political recognition of its distinct history, culture, and language. Recently, this struggle has been coupled with efforts to project the identity of Quebec beyond Canada. The new continentalism and global economic dynamics have led many in Quebec to envision a broader role for the province in North America, in the Caribbean, indeed the rest of the world. In the case of the United States, the only immediate territorial question that could affect the political shape of the country is the status of Puerto Rico. Since its creation in 1952 as an associated free state or commonwealth, Puerto Rico has had a controversial relationship with the United States. In the late 1990s, the question of its future once again became the subject of intense debate. As in the past, voters considered primarily the options of continuation of Commonwealth status, statehood, or independence. In late 1998, they voted none of the above. However, more recently, Puerto Ricans went to the polls and voted in favor of statehood, but without significant percentage of the population voting. So it remains to be seen what happens with Puerto Rico. Politically, it's going to be tough because there are many in the Republican Party who will resist that move. There are many other movements that contribute to political divergence. The revival of the South in the United States, for example, represents a rediscovery and reaffirmation of a cultural and political history long thought dead. The controversy over the last 2 years over Civil War monuments and the legacy of segregation and police violence against African Americans, that reminds us how difficult it's become for the United States to reconcile with its history. A few years ago, there was an article in the Washington Post entitled "The Balkanization of North America," and I'm going to quote from it. "A concern for states' rights, local self-government, and regional identity used to be taken for granted everywhere in America. But the United States is no longer, as it once was, a federal union of diverse states and regions. National uniformity is being imposed by the political class that runs Washington, the economic class that owns Wall Street, and the cultural class in charge of Hollywood and the Ivy League schools." And that was in 1995. That quote sort of helps us understand the rise of populism and the political success of Donald Trump in 2016. Separatist tendencies at the regional and local level continue to embroil politics in all three countries, exemplifying a particularism that comes and goes in North American history. It might seem paradoxical that they would flourish during a period of heightened continental integration, but the paradox is more apparent than real. Narrowly defined regional political associations have enduring strengths that are often fortified as centralization accelerates. They will not disappear. Culture, however defined, is a powerful agent. Culture is a powerful agent that binds individuals to groups that are not limited by nationality. The culture wars, versions of which appear in all three countries of North America, speak to the heart of the matter. Ideologies of class and gender, ethnicity, and race can spread far beyond a region or nation and take on continental dimensions. They become forces for both convergence and divergence. Since the passage of NAFTA, both scholarly and popular assessments of North America suggest a move towards seeing the continent as an integral unit, despite these seemingly different cultural variants. Certainly more and more policy analysts, as well as academics who have studied the continent, see North America as whole and interconnected, rather than as an isolated tripartite of national fragments that occasionally come together for diplomatic niceties. Not everyone agrees, of course, that such assessments reflect accurately historical and contemporary experience. Moreover, popular views and perceptions of what constitutes a North American past and a North American identity vary widely among citizens of Canada, Mexico, and the United States. The tragic events of September 11th, 2001, as well as the US response to terrorism, but now more recently COVID-19, and the profound ebb and flow of Mexican migrants throughout North America have forced some in the public and private sectors to reconsider the continental dimensions of global phenomena, continental and hemispheric security, the defense of porous borders, the gathering and sharing of intelligence, of medical data, health security, the rights of workers who cross borders, the availability and distribution of vaccines, transnational policing, etc. A willingness to historicize these issues beyond the confines of any single nation state will shape the contours of a broader North American understanding of economic integration and political cooperation, not to mention an appreciation of shared civic values and concerns. Transnational approaches to the study of world history have shaped the continental sensibility, my continental sensibility, as I try to historicize the North American past. Rather than evaluate how each of the three nation states interacted with one another, which implicitly allows artificially drawn national boundaries to determine the subject of study, I'm trying to integrate a transnational approach to the problem of North America. As one scholar, Michael Siegel, has argued, transnational history examines units that spill over and seep through national borders, units both greater and smaller than a nation state. For example, Tono Atam peoples, the indigenous peoples known as Tono Atam, have lived in what is today southern Arizona and northern Sonora for centuries. And they continue to cross over an international boundary that was created in the mid-19th century with neither their input nor consent. The Spanish flu epidemic of 1918 failed to stop at the Buffalo, New York, Fort Erie, Ontario border crossing, thus infecting Canadians and Americans of all backgrounds without pausing to determine national identity or citizenship. And certainly with COVID-19, we've seen those examples of the virus crossing international borders. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, factory workers and rural laborers demanded just wages and better working conditions from a North American capitalism shaped as much by Wall Street financiers as by upward shifts in global consumption. Convergence and divergence, therefore, are not expressions of contemporary phenomena, as they have deep roots in the continental features of North American history. Neither simply political nor diplomatic, they reveal the complexities of social cohesion, cultural markers, and similar yet competing material needs. What does all this mean? divergence and convergence will continue to shape North America. It is possible to see a dialectic at work as the currents of convergence trigger the cross currents of divergence, thus providing a basic structure to the past. There is increasing unity in North America as the forces of convergence continue, but divergent trends will continue to defy the unity. Regional and ethnic identities, for example, continue to shape these divergent cross currents. Quebec, the American South, and Chiapas all show how a mix of political economy and culture have worked to undermine national aspirations and in some cases territorial sovereignty. On the other hand, regionalism can enrich our continental perspective. For example, the international boundary that separates the United States and Canada, or that separates Mexico and the United States, has drawn people in search of economic security and social mobility. Over the long haul, a borderland sensibility has developed that reflects issues and concerns germane to these border regions, such as the environment, immigration, or the flow of illegal narcotics, drugs, and more recently, COVID-19. In some ways, the lives of ordinary borderlanders, los fronterizos, provide the bone marrow of this continental framework. Fronterizos come together to identify common interests and shared concerns, while at the same time, they seek to bridge differences in order to find solutions that benefit multiple constituencies and entities without regard to national borders. These citizens of North America, residing where the international border divides as well as unites, show us what is happening on the ground in terms of clean air and water, or the flow of drugs, of disease, immigration, investment capital, trade, and security. By evaluating the global processes that have forged continental convergence as well as divergence, I am trying to transcend the conceptual limitations of viewing North American history as the purview of any one nation state. Take a look at the map you see on the slide. This is a polar projection of North America. It expresses the geographical unity that has influenced my thinking. But as we gaze upon the map, our trained eyes almost intuitively try to draw the national borders that separate the three countries. School curricula in Canada, Mexico, and the United States are developed in part to reflect national aspirations and concerns, and to impart patriotic understandings of the past, all of which seek to mold our geographical consciousness. I call for a comparative framework that asks our students and asks fellow researchers to evaluate the history of North America, not as a series of unrelated and unique culture boxes or political systems, but rather as a complex of historical, cultural, and geographical features that often have transcended political boundaries. As historian Thomas Bender has argued, whatever the distinctive position of the United States today, or the distinctive position of Mexico, or the distinctive position of Canada, it remains nonetheless only one global province interconnected with and interdependent with every other. The history of the United States, the history of Canada, the history of Mexico is but one history among histories. To conclude, I want to draw our attention to the structural features of North American history, what might be called, the structural features of the North American experience. These characteristics and patterns that endure for long periods of time. This approach has advantages, of course, and disadvantages. Historical abstractions conceal much of the diversity and richness of the past, but abstractions also can reveal broad patterns of change and continuity that are essential for interpreting North America as a whole. A common assumption among many historians and their students is that the trifurcation of the North American past is somehow natural and timeless, that national histories provide a sufficient conceptual framework for explaining change over time. From the vantage point of the early 21st century, when more and more scholars are employing world history paradigms and interdisciplinary methodologies in their research and teaching, national histories, which often have been written without much regard to sustain contact and exchange with other cultures and societies, provide but one kind of narrative of the human experience. Our task has been, or my task has been, to recast the narrative in a much larger context, that of the continent, rather than just its constituent parts. To be sure, a continental understanding of North America includes a rigorous examination of the scholarship produced in Mexico, in Canada, and in the United States, which identifies and interprets what is considered unique and exceptional to the historical experiences of each nation state. At the same time, however, the similarities and differences in historical trajectory point to the continental dimensions of political economy, cross-cultural contact and exchange, trade, and a consumer culture that creates demand for the material expressions of yet another age of globalization. Simultaneously complex and subtle, predictable and elusive, the forces of convergence and divergence test the ability of our continental approach to explain the history of North America in a persuasive and meaningful way. I want to emphasize the two bedrock features, or what I consider to be the two bedrock features of North American history. Two fundamental characteristics deserve emphasis at the outset. First is the size and distribution of Indian peoples before the arrival of Europeans. The difference in the historical development of central and southern Mexico and the rest of North America derives in large part from the dense concentration of indigenous peoples in the highland valleys of Mexico. The entire Spanish colonial enterprise in Mexico, from the cathedrals and government palaces of the cities to the mines and haciendas of the countryside, depended upon indigenous labor. With indigenous labor, Spain was able to build a larger, more complex colonial world much more rapidly than England and France to the north. The achievements of Spain came at a cost. Native peoples were subordinate to Spaniards and restricted to secondary roles in the new colonial society. Little opportunity existed for them to improve their lives, although it would be incorrect to compare their situation to the one in India, where a rigid caste system separated people. Some mobility and flexibility existed, but overall, colonial life controlled and dominated indigenous peoples. The political structure separated them from Spaniards and imposed special restrictions and burdens on them. The economic system exploited them, and prevailing social and cultural beliefs relegated them to an inferior position. Mexico carried this burden into the 21st century. A second bedrock feature of North American history was the timing of colonization. Spain was caught between the medieval and modern worlds in the first years of the 16th century. Its most enduring legacy was the Reconquista, the almost 800-year-long process of reconquering the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim control. As the reconquest unfolded, it helped to define the social and economic patterns that Spain introduced into Mexico. Status and wealth were equated with force of arms, the right to collect tribute, and control over vast estates. The ideal of the señor, the seigneurial lord, admired for his power as well as his large farms, his ornate clothing and carriages, provided inspiration for the new immigrants who arrived from Spain. At the same time, Spaniards arrived in Mexico full of a Renaissance drive for knowledge, wealth, and power. They inherited many of the ideas of the modern world: business organization, accounting and insurance practices, new techniques in map making and navigation, and the ability to diffuse knowledge quickly through the printing press. In this sense, Spaniards were as modern as the English and French colonists who followed 100 years later. Yet their modernity always butted up against a past that lingered in their minds and actions. They strove to recreate as accurately as possible the life of a medieval lord with his titles and power based on the ownership of large landed estates and control over subordinates and retainers. The availability of a large indigenous population to shoulder the burdens of building a new society helped Spaniards to accomplish their objectives. Although they arrived a century later, the plantation owners in the slave societies of the southern United States also fit the mold. Despite these characteristics of Mexican history that give it a strong Latin American texture, thick historical threads bound it to the north instead of the south. War, diplomacy, commerce, transportation, immigration, all had more of a northern than a southern dynamic. Patterns of colonization and a shared frontier with the United States also linked it to the north. The northern tier of Mexico, with its small Indian population, harsh climate, and wide open spaces, developed a culture different from that of central Mexico or the slave societies of the South. More open, mobile, and egalitarian than the Mexican South, northern Mexico, like Sonora and Chihuahua, was a land of opportunity during much of its history. It shared an ethos closer to that emerging in the British colonies in the 18th century than central Mexico in the 16th century. French Canada was in a slightly different position. The French created a seigneurial system reminiscent of the feudal past that called for the settlers to pay their lords rents and dues. These were usually modest and at times not paid. Indeed, the system often worked to the advantage of the settlers, since the lords had to provide them with expensive grist mills and ovens. Further weakening the system was the opportunity for settlers to leave their land and enter the world of the fur trade. The result was the failure of a rigid hierarchical feudal system to develop. The early history of the colonies laid the foundation for many of the social and cultural differences found within North America. The meaning of race is an important example. In Canada, race had little to do with genetic characteristics or physical difference. Instead, it emphasized the cultural and historical differences between French and English settlers. Historians wrote books and politicians gave speeches about the race question in Canada, many discussing the superiority of Anglo-Saxon political and economic institutions and the inferiority of French Canadian ones. In turn, French Canadians expressed belief in their own superiority when they spoke of the future of their race in the face of English domination of Canada. Mexico, with its large African and Indian population, was racially more complex than Canada. Yet by the early 19th century, ideas about race had little to do with Africans and much to do with indigenous peoples and mestizos. The deep-seated practices of discrimination against indigenous peoples continued through the colonial period. Independence from Spain eliminated their legal inferiority, but not the prejudice directed against them. The Mexican Revolution of 1910 further liberated indigenous peoples, but still did not end their inferior position in society. The glorious portrayal of Indians in the greater art of the post-revolutionary period did not change their miserable conditions. I'm going to wrap up by talking about some of the leading indicators in the early 21st century. The forces of convergence continue to drive the integration of the continent. People, culture, and goods and services move north and south at a dizzying pace, making borders less significant in the development of each nation state. As this integration intensifies, it produces reactions. Increased immigration leads to cultural change and political movements. Trade agreements create hardships and prompt demands for renegotiations. Labor searches for new forms of organization to promote its interests. Regions and localities assert their distinctiveness and demand more and more autonomy. New continental organizations, particularly those involving education, the environment, arbitrate disputes and plan for the future. These thrusts and parries have been part of the past and will continue to influence the future. They have not yet produced major political restructuring of the continent. They are, in a sense, a continuation of the old continentalism of the 19th century, pushing for foreign investment, lower tariffs, and foreign trade. Mexico is very much a part of this new continentalism, whereas in the past, it always had strong reservations about the political consequences of closer integration with the United States. The new wave of continentalism of the 1990s did not promote major political changes, but the Quebec situation and then also Chiapas, and more recently, the resurgence of populism under Donald Trump and Andrés Manuel López Obrador continue to add new elements of uncertainty. The border between Mexico and the United States is yet another element of instability. It, more so than the Canadian border, has experienced intense economic and social change since the 1960s, including a constant influx of Spanish speakers seeking employment, the establishment of the maquiladoras in need of foreign investment, hybrid cultural forms, and the violence associated with drug trafficking. A part of this change has been the development of a culture that has claims to its own distinctiveness, different from those in central Mexico and the United States. US-Mexico border culture, always in continuous formation, is the subject of much more commentary and debate than that along the northern border. Although 9/11 and COVID-19 have raised security concerns about the porous nature of the US-Canadian border. The Canadian penchant for promoting multiculturalism within a framework sensitive to the political realities of a multilingual society adds another social dimension to northern border culture whose long-term effects are difficult to ascertain. And certainly, as I've alluded to, very problematic was the administration of Donald Trump as president of the United States. The political implications of these changes along the border remain elusive to define in any fixed and concrete way. A set of distinct educational, linguistic, health, security, environmental, and economic problems has emerged that seeks political expression in order to facilitate solutions amiable to the three nation states of North America. There are many possibilities for political and economic realignments, some of which reflect a post 9/11 and a post COVID-19 security and health concerns, while others who had conjured up broader initiatives, bolder initiatives that went beyond free trade now find themselves muted. Trinational cooperation, economic integration become part of a diplomatic lexicon that the US political leadership, particularly under Donald Trump, employs when domestic politics makes it convenient. Such rhetoric often gets used as a response to concerns about immigration or the explosive growth of Asian economies or the spread of so-called Islamic terrorism. In other words, the broader question becomes, how can continental cooperation serve the interests of the nation state? I should add, this populist streak that we're finding now in the United States and Mexico is nothing new. It's not difficult to imagine Mexico, the United States, or even Canada clamoring for disengagement and pullback from even a diluted form of continentalism. And I want to end by saying just a few words, and I promise I'm almost finished, a little bit about the challenges here and sort of ending on a larger conceptual note that is a little poetic. I pose a larger question to our audience. More challenging for each country, Canada, US, and Mexico, to me, from my perspective, is to find a solution to the poverty that undermines society and produces widespread alienation. Mexico suffers the most from the burdens of the past and the political and economic problems of the present. Great regional, class, and ethnic disparities overshadow the many economic gains made since World War II and make it difficult for Mexico to claim the first world status that it wants. However, Canada and the United States, while both consider themselves successful economically by most measures, those two countries have also failed to eliminate poverty and the social injustice that accompanies it. Thick seams of poverty run from urban neighborhoods, New York City, Toronto, Vancouver, Tucson, Phoenix, Los Angeles, to agricultural little towns and villages throughout places like West Virginia, Alberta, in Texas and South Dakota and Alabama, entrapping the elderly poor, the inner city youth, and migrant farm workers. The history of North America gives rise to both optimism and pessimism. From the earliest days of European settlement, idealists have sought to improve the lives of the marginal and oppressed. Yet, neither reformer, revolutionary, nor utopian dreamer has been able to overcome the problems of inequality. To be sure, progress has been made, but severe social problems remain. One significant difference between current efforts at reform and those of the past is the continental response to inequality and injustice. Whether describing the plight of indigenous peoples in Chiapas, migrant farm workers in British Columbia, or in California, Arizona, Texas, the problems and issues are large and complex enough that they now require continental-wide attention in a much broader response. North America watchers, like myself, have long argued that a broader perspective, one unfettered by purely national concerns, generates innovative solutions to the problems of the continent, thus holding out the promise of a new era of political cooperation and economic integration. New eras often begin, however, when different answers emerge to older questions. For example, my favorite poem of Robert Frost is Mending Wall, which he published in 1914. So I ask our audience today for this primer Congreso Virtual de Estudios Norteamericanos, which line from Robert Frost's poem best captures, best encapsulates the North American sensibility in 2021? Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen ground swell under it and spills the upper boulders in the sun. Before I build a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. Not of woods only and the shade of trees, he will not go behind his father's saying. And he likes having thought of it so well, he says again, good fences make good neighbors. How each of us responds to Frost's poetic language may, on some metaphysical plane, fashion a collective response that accommodates, rejects, or modifies continentalism. While many future scholars will continue to study North America through the prism of the nation state, by standing firmly on their side of the border and peering over the good fence, others will cross disciplinary boundaries and scale conceptual walls in an effort to see North America as a whole. Many thanks, muchísimas gracias por su amable atención y por su paciencia. Con mi ponencia reconozco que hablé mucho, pero thank you so much for your kind attention, and muy buena suerte. Good luck as this conference unfolds over the next several days.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias, Michael, por esta extraordinaria conferencia magistral que nos permite precisamente encontrar lo que queríamos para este congreso, que es las raíces históricas de las convergencias y las divergencias en la construcción y la ampliación de las complejas interacciones entre los actores sociales de la región, mucho más allá del comercio, mucho más allá de los gobiernos en turno. Nosotros, al escucharte, nos queda claro la gran amplitud de procesos, cuán largos son, la importancia de entender las relaciones de poder, la reproducción de estas desigualdades que tanto nos duelen, las injusticias que pues generalmente las separamos en diferentes espacios, pero como bien nos has recordado, nos laceran dentro de las ciudades, en todo el continente, nos laceran en los campos, en la producción de nuestra comida, en la producción de nuestras mercancías, en la producción de nuestros productos culturales. Y pues bueno, pues esta propuesta tuya para tomar en cuenta estas perspectivas transnacionales y comparativas complejas, multidimensionales, que nos permiten además entender el territorio como un espacio socialmente organizado, en procesos que nos superan, que seguirán su curso más allá de los personajes actuales que también muy atinadamente nos has ayudado a contextualizar. También yo quisiera agradecerte infinitamente, antes de darle la palabra a la directora del CISAN, la importancia de los pueblos originarios para entender los procesos de colonización que se han venido dando y que perseveran, que continúan y que son pues una dinámica intrínseca a esta a los procesos que ahora se ven como cuestiones socioculturales, ¿no? Cuestiones económicos, políticos, de seguridad, y parecen como despojados de su verdadero proceso, que es lo que nos tiene a todos los que vivimos en esta amplia zona del mundo, pues moviéndonos en direcciones, pues no siempre las que querríamos, viviendo nuestra vida en complejos financieros, legales, diplomáticos, logísticos, que son la complejidad de esta región. Realmente te agradezco. Además, en particular, que haya cerrado con una poesía. Que sí. No hay lenguaje más amplio que un recordatorio de más de 100 años. Ojalá que podamos mejorar esta barda.
Sí, exactamente. Pues gracias por sus palabras, Juan Carlos.
Gracias a ti. Graciela, no sé si quieras comentar algo.
Pues solo que esta ponencia ha sido verdaderamente magistral.
Gracias.
Creo que es un punto de partida excelente para empezar a responder que sí somos una región, que más allá de los tratados sí somos una región, compartimos una historia. Creo que el recorrido que nos ha dado el doctor Brescia por los textos históricos que comenzaron a desvincularnos y las realidades que nos vinculan actualmente, más allá de esas lecturas históricas, nos da pie para comenzar a responder lo que queremos durante estos 5 días ir aprendiendo. Muchas gracias, doctor Brescia.
Gracias a usted por sus comentarios muy bonitos. Me alegro mucho.
No, de verdad ha sido una, pues es muy difícil, doctor, nosotros que somos norteamericanistas, es muy difícil que encontremos a alguien que se especialice en la región como un todo. Generalmente estudiamos a Estados Unidos o estudiamos a Canadá o las relaciones México-Estados Unidos o las relaciones México-Canadá, y generalmente digamos que casi la mayor parte de los esfuerzos tanto de las y los canadienses como de las y los mexicanos es entender Estados Unidos. Entonces,
yo también. Los últimos 4 años. Sí.
Entonces, creo que ha sido una manera espléndida de comenzar, de verdad. Creo difícilmente, aunque estudie uno las historias, es muy difícil pensar en ir reconstruyendo, ¿no? A partir de esas historias, una historia común, y es lo que usted nos ha permitido hoy a partir de la profundidad de su estudio, y pues muchas gracias.
Muy amable a la doctora Graciela. La verdad, soy estadounidense, pero soy mexicanista, ¿no? Me doctoré en la historia mexicana. Cuando mi coautor y yo empezamos a escribir el libro, yo tuve que leer historias de mi propio país, ni se diga de Canadá, ¿no? Para aprender, para tener un buen entendimiento de Estados Unidos, porque ya yo estaba muy metido en la historia mexicana desde la época precolombina hasta la actualidad. Para mí, para esta conferencia magistral, lo que me costó trabajo, tuve que evitar la tentación de hablar mucho sobre los últimos años, sobre el expresidente Trump y el presidente Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Lo que me ayudó es, como historiador, necesito el contexto, tengo que esperar el cambio, ¿no? El tiempo, las olas de tiempo antes de comentar. Quiero decir, Los profesores que puedan hablar más sobre el populismo de Trump o del presidente López Obrador son los profesores de ciencia política. Por lo menos eso es mi escape. Porque falta el cambio, ¿no? A través del tiempo. Y para comentar o hacer un análisis más profunda que a plazo corto.
Claro, que los comentarios surgidos de la pasión del momento.
Exactamente, pues sí.
Así es.
Sí.
Tenemos...
No, a ver, tú di, Juancho.
Bueno, solamente comentar que agradecemos mucho la presencia de más de 50 personas en vivo en YouTube. Hemos recibido muchas felicitaciones, no podría leerlas todas, pero les agradecemos a todos los que se han tomado la molestia de enviar comentarios a través del canal de YouTube. Camelia Tigau fue la primera, pero después de allí vienen muchísimos comentarios que les agradecemos a todas y todos. Todos son de felicitación, enviando saludos y felicitaciones al doctor Brescia por su extraordinaria presentación. También felicitaciones para el Congreso, en fin. Y bueno, particularmente pues llegó una última pregunta que no sé si tengamos tiempo de resolverla, pero bueno, la dejaré para tenerla en mente, que nos envió Agustín Sánchez Orendain sobre ¿qué piensas, Michael, sobre el futuro de las relaciones en los próximos 3 años. Él pregunta sobre entre México y Estados Unidos, pero creo que aplica por la perspectiva de tu entrevista, de tu conferencia a toda la región. Entonces, pues son temas muy amplios que quedan aquí, pero quiero decirte que la reacción en las redes sociales nos ha permitido tener además un acceso más amplio del que tendríamos. Estaríamos muy contentos en la Escuela de Medicina, ofreciéndote uno de los lugares más excelsos que están en resguardo de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, y viendo la biblioteca palafoxiana que nos inspira atrás de ti. Pues hubiera sido también un buen recinto para esta reflexión, pero bueno.
Para el próximo.
Ya será en próximas ocasiones. Y bueno, pues a mí no me quedaría más que hacer ese mensaje, recordarle a los ponentes, antes de que se dé la palabra para terminar esta sesión, avisar a los ponentes que en el programa vienen las ligas de Zoom, están en el logo de cada sesión, está un logo con el Zoom, y entonces ustedes pueden entrar a su sesión o a otras sesiones a través de ese hipervínculo que trae su programa. Entonces no tienen que recibir ningún registro, no tienen que esperar nada, ya lo tienen en el programa. Y pues bueno, al público en general les decimos que estaremos subiendo de manera no simultánea, pero iremos subiendo poco a poco las sesiones para que sean abiertas al público. Entonces, por razones de logística, pues bueno, vamos primero grabando y luego subiendo, pero pues bueno, el recordatorio pues a los ponentes es, ya tienen todos el hipervínculo, está en el logo de Zoom, solamente tienen que darle clic allí y entrar a la sesión que quieran acceder. Eso sería de mi parte los avisos, Gra.
Sí, eso, y por favor que entren unos pocos minutos antes, porque siempre hay problemas con con los PowerPoints. Entonces, para que los probemos antes de comenzar. Y bueno, pues muchas gracias, doctor Brescia, muchas gracias, Juancho, Esme, Samuel, muchas gracias por haber participado en esta espléndida inauguración que hemos tenido en este momento y pues vayamos a las mesas.
Ojalá que nos veamos pronto en persona.
Sí, sí, eso
Muy
significará que el bicho está domado.
Excelente. Pues buena suerte a todos por el Congreso y mil gracias por la invitación muy amable.
No,
seguimos
gracias
en contacto y nos vemos en el Congreso.
Sí.
Virtualmente.
Nos vemos.
Okay.
Adiós.
Nos vemos.
Hasta luego.
Adiós.
Gracias.
Gracias.